Through Varlast, the world flows. The gold lettering above the harbour master's office had proclaimed this truth for 8 centuries. From her study in the high tower of Lumvaris Manor, Lady Seraphina Lumvaris could see the proof stretched out across the horizon. Hundreds of ships from all 4 continents crowded the great harbour, their holds heavy with the goods that existed nowhere else in such abundance. Northern metals and southern lumber, eastern grain and northern furs, southern wines and eastern spices. Even trade between the frigid northern continent and the vast eastern continents, separated by countless leagues of treacherous ocean, flowed safer and cheaper through Varlast's harbour at the northern tip of the southern continent. The city produced nothing of its own, yet it had grown wealthy beyond compare by being the inevitable meeting point where all the world's trade converged. Lady Seraphina set down the merchant's report with trembling fingers. Whether she trembled from rage or fear, she could not say. The Lumvaris fortune, built entirely on careful trade agreements and strategic port fees, had made House Lumvaris the wealthiest family across all 4 continents. But this report threatened everything. "Impossible architecture," she read aloud, her voice met with a clashing echo throughout the marble chamber. Buildings raised in minutes by beings of pure magic, a city growing in the thermal wastes surrounding the Western Pass. The words were a frightening match with her great-great-grandfather's private journals. Lord Lumvaris had written extensively about his encounter with the Mistral Hamaya, and he described exactly such feats. With access to sufficient energy, Hamaya had shaped structures from stone as if it were clay. She insisted that she was a perfectly ordinary Mistral, and yet she had been able to accomplish in hours what human architects required months to achieve. Most nobles would have dismissed such reports as fantasy, but Seraphina knew better. Her family had known this day might come for generations. Seraphina moved to the great window that dominated her study's western wall. Beyond the forest of masts and the vast grasslands beyond that, the Getsurio Mountains rose like a wall, dividing the southern continent. For generations, those peaks had been Varlast's greatest blessing. Every trade route between the southern continent's east and west funneled through the Western Pass, while the treacherous seas between the northern and eastern continents made Varlast's position the safest waypoint for intercontinental commerce. The Lumvaris family had grown unimaginably rich on pure geographic necessity. Varlast produced nothing. No crops, no crafts, no raw materials beyond a negligible mining operation in the city's south. Instead, Seraphina's ancestors had negotiated treaties, built relationships, and established the complex web of diplomacy that made Varlast indispensable to global commerce. Every transaction, every currency exchange, every cargo transfer that kept intercontinental trade running passed through their city. Her city. But now, a new city was rising. Unlike other noble families who dismissed Miskrals as fairy tales, House Lumvaris remembered. Records written by Seraphina's ancestor Lord Lumvaris spoke of his meeting with the legendary Mistral Hamaya generations ago. Those conversations, carefully preserved in the family archives, had taught them that Miskrals were real, and that their magical abilities could reshape the very foundations of civilization if they ever moved beyond their millennia of isolation. Lady Seraphina first heard whispers 3 months ago. Traders returning from the eastern kingdoms spoke of strange happenings near the mountains. caravans arriving days ahead of schedule, their goods somehow better preserved than usual. Stories of some shortcut through the thermal wastes that no sane person would attempt. She had initially dismissed it as the usual collection of tall tales that trickled in between trade seasons. Lone merchants loved their stories of narrow escapes and unexplored marvels, especially when such yarns impressed investors and potential lovers. But these stories were more consistent, more specific, more troubling. Captain Van Maar, one of Seraphina's most trusted caravan masters, had returned yesterday with a tale that defied belief. He spoke of a city, not a camp or even a settlement, but an actual city rising from the geothermal fields where nothing should be able to live. Buildings that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Residents with magenta skin and flowing horns who wielded magic like craftsmen wielded their tools. They demonstrated their construction techniques for us, Van Maar had reported, his weathered old face rejuvenated with childlike wonder. Added a guest room to a house in the time it takes to shoe a horse, my lady. Like properly built. Real stone, real foundations, but shaped like clay in their hands. And the most damning detail of all? Passing through the new city shaved more than a day from Van Maar's journey. It wasn't just an alternative to the Western Pass, it was a better one. Shorter, more direct, with terrain that could support heavier loads and larger caravans. Seraphina's gaze fell upon the portrait of Lord Lumvaris himself, her great-great-grandfather, whose private journals were her family's most closely guarded secret. His stern face seemed to judge her from his gilded frame, as if questioning whether she had learned the lessons he tried to pass down. In those journals he had penned a prediction. Should the Miskrals ever break from their isolation and build among themselves, the result will surely be as frightening and awesome as the mountains themselves. The world order itself should shudder at such a prospect. 4 generations of Lumvaris descendants had continued to build their wealth not on production, but on location, all while knowing that their ancestor had encountered beings who could make that location irrelevant. Varlast existed purely as a necessary intermediary, skimming profits from every transaction that crossed between continents or mountain ranges. What would happen if the world no longer needed that intermediary? Seraphina had run the calculations, guided by Lord Lumvaris's detailed observations of Mistral capabilities. Varlast produced nothing. The city's entire economy, its entire existence, was predicated on being the unavoidable bottleneck through which commerce flowed. If this new Mistral city, Fumeron, the reports called it, could really offer magical preservation of goods, supernatural construction speed, and expedited passage through the mountains, as the evidence suggested, then Varlast's well-established trade networks could be obsolete within a single season. Every warehouse, every bank, every merchant house in Varlast existed solely to serve the trade of other cities and nations. Goods that originated elsewhere and were destined for somewhere else. If traders chose to rest and restock in Fumeron instead of Varlast, then Varlast had nothing. If Fumeron chose to compete rather than cooperate. My lady? Seraphina's secretary, Master Adric, appeared in the doorway. I have assembled the council, as you requested. The lesser houses await your guidance. Seraphina nodded, straightening her shoulders. House Lumvaris had not maintained its influence for centuries by responding passively to looming threats. And unlike the other houses, they had been preparing for this possibility since Lord Lumvaris first penned his warning about Mistral capabilities. If this Fumeron represented the challenge that her ancestor had foreseen, then it was a challenge Seraphina understood better than anyone else. but understanding Miskrals and competing with them were entirely different matters. From her tower, Lady Seraphina could see the proof of Varlast's precarious prosperity. The world harbour stretched for miles, its numerous piers accommodating vessels from all 4 continents. The merchant quarter buzzed with activity in dozens of languages as northern traders exchanged goods for southern luxuries. The Lumvaris exchange house processed currencies from every major power, its rates setting the standard for commerce around the world. All of this existed because geography made Varlast essential. The Getsuriu Mountains, the dangerous intercontinental sea routes, and the complex web of political agreements had created a world where nothing moved without passing through their city. But necessity was on the verge of being circumvented, exactly as Lord Lumvaris had warned. The reports from the thermal region described not just a city, but an existential provocation that could end Varlast's dominance. Her ancestors' journals had prepared her to recognize the risks. Beings who could reshape the landscape itself could create new passages through the mountains. Magic that could preserve goods indefinitely could make longer sea routes viable. Creatures who needed no traditional supply chains could bypass the entire trade network that kept Varlast alive. If Fumeron offered the world an alternative to dependence on Varlast, what did a city that produced nothing have to counter such a bold regime shift? As Lady Seraphina prepared to address the assembled noble houses, one question dominated her thoughts. Were these Miskrals the threat her ancestors had foreseen? Or were they something even worse? The family archives contained detailed observations about Miskrals, their dependence on environmental energies, their magical construction abilities, their tendency towards isolation. Lord Lumvaris had concluded his journals on a note of both admiration and warning. Hemaya's people possess capabilities that could reshape civilization itself should they ever choose to engage with the wider world. Their isolation is perhaps the only barrier that preserves the existing hegemony. Now, that isolation was ending. An optimistic perspective suggested opportunity. A magical city adjacent to improved trade routes could mean increased commerce, new exotic goods, and profitable relationships with beings whose abilities could enhance rather than replace traditional trade. The pessimistic view, supported by her ancestors' detailed analysis of Miskril capabilities, promised catastrophe. A technologically superior civilization with no stake in existing power structures could obliterate centuries of carefully negotiated advantages in a single trade season. But perhaps the most troubling was the unknown. What did these Miskrals want? Her ancestors' notes led Seraphina to the inference that they built their city purely for survival, with no awareness of its strategic significance. If she was right, then first impressions would be crucial. The initial relationships formed with Fumeron might determine whether it became Varlast's greatest ally, or spelled their doom. Lady Seraphina smoothed her dress, gathered the reports, and prepared to address the most important council meeting in Varlast's history. Outside, the harbor continued its ancient rhythm, but Seraphina could not shake the feeling that she was about to witness the end of an age. The rise of Fumeron might herald the fall of everything she and her family had built. Or perhaps, if handled with appropriate wisdom and diplomacy, it might offer opportunities beyond anything previous generations had imagined. The choice, she realized, might depend on decisions made by people she had never met, in a place she had never seen, for reasons she did not yet understand. The fate of the wealthiest city in the world now rested in the hands of strangers. Your story begins 4 months earlier as you traverse the Western Pass. You happen to cross at just the right time to bear witness to the very beginning of Fumeron. You watch as a group of Miskrals raise the first houses out of the thermal wastes, but who are you?